interesting you say that, because I think one of the things that's happened in Ukraine is the US and Europe have been very careful to, sure, they're sending weapons to Ukraine, but they're not committing troops. They don't want to go in. NATO doesn't want to go in because then that could spark a wider conflict. But it sounds like what you're saying is essentially that the Chinese Communist Party is not afraid to start with a wider conflict.
I think that's right. From their perspective, that may actually be an advantage because you don't want your opponents to be able to focus on you exclusively. I mentioned the nuclear card earlier, and it's not as if that's being ignored, not at all. In fact, the avowed reason why American forces aren't in Ukraine, Western forces, is because of that nuclear threat. The American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, General Austin, said in front of the House Armed Services Committee the other day that, well, the reason why we haven't got troops there is because Russia's nuclear armed. And we don't want to do that when there's an opponent in there that has nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, I understand their thinking, but I think it was poorly articulated. They might have even been better not to articulate it at all. Because what you might hear if you're sitting in Beijing is that, well, if the other side has nuclear weapons, didn't the Americans just say that they won't send troops in? That's not really what you want the other side to hear. And then the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was asked a few days later, is America going to fight to defend Taiwan if China attacks? And he says, well, we're going to make sure they don't attack. He didn't answer that question. And what you're doing is you're perhaps raising some doubts about American resolve, commitment, when faced with a nuclear-armed opponent. Logically, when faced with a real threat of nuclear escalation, well, maybe the Americans will back down.
Even before Ukraine, I mean, there were people writing opinion pieces I saw in Western media about how we should not intervene if China attacks Taiwan because of the nuclear weapons. Like that argument was pretty much already out there, right?
It's always been there, but it's unusual to hear top officials comment on it this way. And I think if you ask them about it, they would say, no, we didn't really mean that. But nonetheless, that's what people hear. And it is one interpretation, and the doubt is always there as to how much we will do. And you could imagine an opponent, if it smells weakness, if it sees its adversaries confused, that it keeps doubling down. It says, well, I am going to use these things. Do you feel lucky today? And say it does, as I mentioned, throw out a tactical nuclear weapon somewhere, and try to scare us off. That this is really high stakes poker, and if the other side keeps doubling down, you had better be ready to play that game, because there's the tendency has always been to think, well, nobody will ever take it too far. But you do have a couple of regimes, at least on this planet, that are willing to take it that far, it seems. So the free world had better sort of have its wits about it whenever what's coming next comes. And that House Armed Services Committee testimony, I thought it deserved a little more attention than it got, because it was sort of a curious statement to say. It did bring to mind, of course, Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State in 1950, making that speech. It was an obscure speech to some gathering in Washington, effectively saying that the Americans didn't think the Korean Peninsula was in its direct defensive perimeter. Well, guess how the other side heard that? And of course, it's been nowadays the commentariat has parsed his language to say, well, he didn't really say that or didn't really mean it. Well, that's how it was interpreted, apparently. You do have to be very careful. But this is, it's a type of warfare that we haven't really had to deal with for forever. And we do need to sort of have some pretty clear thinking about that and clear statements also.
Now, you brought up Korea. So I want to talk a little bit about Korea and how their sort of perspective on China has changed in recent years, and in particular, the new president who was elected, and he'll take office in next month. So how has their thinking on China changed recently?
Well, the interesting thing about Korea is that there's been no great love for China for a while. It's instinctive, and partly it's historic, and anthropologists could probably explain it better. But the Korean public has always been looked askance at the Chinese, and particularly with this flood of Chinese investment, Chinese tourists, that sort of hasn't, made feelings any a whole lot warmer.
Right, especially after the Chinese state-run media claimed that kimchi has been
part of China
since ancient times.
Well, I mean,
that's the big uproar in South Korea.
What they said was even more offensive in a certain way, because they were just like, kimchi is a type of pao cai, which is like pickled vegetables in Chinese, right? So it's like not just saying that kimchi belongs to China, but like kimchi is not a thing almost, that like it's only like a subcategory of this wider thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that we laugh about that, but that does give you plenty of insights into Korean thinking about China. But more to the immediate question, the previous South Korean administration of Moon Jae-in, they were basically pro-China. They were trying to sort of cuddle up to the Chinese and ingratiate themselves. And that was in line with Moon Jae-in's political leanings and a lot of his party's political leanings. But the new movement, the new administration, the conservative President Yoon, they're simply, I'd say, more normal in that they say, we're not picking a fight with anyone, but we do have our interests and we know what we think, and we're glad to deal with China, but we're not going to kowtow to them. And that appears to be a widely supported position. And he's been much more clear that the United States is, in fact, a key ally of South Korea than his predecessor was, who didn't really think it was. But that has been a shift in the Korean political world lately, or just in March was the election. So that is a change, but it's worth keeping in mind that the previous administration was the Democratic Party of Korea. They have an overwhelming majority in the National Assembly, which is their Congress. So that makes it harder for the Korean president, even if he's a conservative, to govern and do what he wants. But he does have the authority to sort of set the tone for things, and there is a lot that he can do to draw South Korea back from that sort of unhealthy relationship with China. But as you've noted, it is interesting that the man on the street level, there is no great love for the People's Republic of China, or in some respects even Chinese. And so that is a big shift that's taken place in South Korea. It's also worth noting that, if you remember, after the previous president, Moon, was elected, and then the National Assembly election results were heavily in favor of his party, that the foreign media was, of course, writing that conservatives are dead in South Korea, they're going extinct. Well, apparently not. And once again, you read the foreign media coverage of a place, and it's often good to discount it by a certain healthy bit. But it's Korean sort of political world is just as complex as anywhere, and is as much a range of thinking as you'll find anywhere. But it has bought itself, owing to a very closely run election victory, it has bought itself some time to sort of prevent that leftward lean and also northward lean, because the previous administration was, in fact, kind of pro-North Korea. So that is a big change. And I think the Biden administration must have really breathed a sigh of relief when they saw the election results in South Korea, because the Team Biden doesn't need any more problems to deal with.
I think it's one of the things that between the China-South Korea relationship too is that China had a lot of maybe economic influence in South Korea, because there was so much tourism, there was so much people coming over to Korea, like buying things, and now with the coronavirus, it's very hard for Chinese people to leave China anymore. So then you kind of almost cut off that economic influence without meaning to, really. But there's less of that now. And I think also, they've also shot themselves in the foot in the last 5 or 6 years, like with the THAAD thing and, trying to protest South Korea economically. And all of that leads to just more decoupling economically between two countries. But then that is what really gave you that influence over that country.
Yeah, that was a big change. You mentioned THAAD, and that's that anti-missile system that the Americans put in 2016-17, and the Chinese howled, and they cut off sort of business with South Korea. They stopped tourists from going. It was a huge economic hit to South Korea, which nobody liked, but it didn't make the Chinese any more popular. Also, sort of more under the radar at that time, that there was a lot of Chinese investment into South Korea. It was kind of out of control, buying up all sorts of things. And there were plans for something like 20 or 30 Chinatowns being set up all over South Korea, plans for these sort of retirement homes or second home villages for rich Chinese people to come to South Korea. And none of that did much for China's image in South Korea. There's, so what the previous administration was trying to do in South Korea really wasn't all that popular. And it actually was a political issue that was one of the things that contributed to the Conservative Party candidate winning the last election.
I remember I went to South Korea with Chris in 2016. At the time, one of the things that we observed is that the Korean media was heavily influenced by China, between pressure from the government, although that was a different government then, and like sort of the broadcast deals that KBS, Korea's big state quasi-state run broadcaster, like they had deals in China, programming deals and whatnot. And so there was a lot of, when the media is influenced by China, that has a huge impact on the public and to a degree politics, because politics is responsive to the public. And if the public is responsive to the media, and then if politics can control the media, you see like there's this loop, right? And so that what I kind of garnered from that is that the Chinese Communist Party was pretty successful, at least at the time, at using South Korean media kind of as its weapon in Korea.
Yeah, you've described it correctly, and it did go beyond when you were there. That it was really just these unhealthy tie-ups between South Korean media and Chinese media, but also the previous Korean administration was able to bring a good chunk of the mainstream media under his control. And this alliance with China, the tie-ups, was actually something that kind of suited his interests, suited the administration's interests, and they thought it was good. But there has still been a degree of sort of conservative media that still exists in South Korea, and it's pretty powerful, pretty active. But you had, with the previous South Korean administration, when it came to ties with China, North Korea, that they were trying to take the country, I think, where most people didn't want to go, even people who voted for the Democratic Party in Korea. So that was an interesting part of the dynamic, is that most South Koreans didn't want to sort of kowtow to the Chinese, and all this Chinese inflow of ideas, of people, of money. That was alarming to many Koreans, well outside the just conservative circles. So the previous administration really was run by a hardcore coterie of some pretty ideological leftists who were intent on transforming Korea, as I said, in a way that was not entirely popular with most people.